Good evening to all of you. Welcome to a journey into the depths of history, into an abyss where reason falters and the shadows of the inexplicable loom. We delve into a topic that, by its nature, awakens unease and fascination in equal measure. A name that resonates with an almost unbearable historical and moral burden. Adolf Hitler. If at this instant a simple photograph, a black and white image of that man, were to appear before your eyes, perhaps astonishment or disbelief would seize you, because Adolf Hitler was not merely a historical figure. He was that individual, endowed with a rhetorical capacity as perverse as it was hypnotic, capable of igniting the flames of euphoria and fanaticism in the hearts of millions of people. His voice, an incessant torrent of promises and accusations, was the catalyst that propelled vast multitudes to wear identical uniforms, to march in impeccable formations, to raise their hands in a mechanical salute, and to shout slogans with a chilling unanimity. And, sadly, this forced cohesion did not culminate in the construction of a utopia, but in the inevitable march towards annihilation and sacrifice. It is imperative to recognize that both extremes manifested with excessive brutality. On the one hand, there were those who dedicated themselves, with calculated coldness, to the systematic elimination of innocent lives, meticulously documented crimes that still haunt us today. On the other, countless individuals marched blindly, imbued with a blind faith in this leader, to find a cruel and senseless death on the battlefields or in the horrors of the extermination camps. The echo of their screams and the stench of gunpowder still float in the ethereal record of collective memory. For countless years, the figure of Adolf Hitler has been carved into the collective imagination as the embodiment of absolute evil, the personification of the worst human being who has ever walked the face of the earth. This perception, while understandable given the magnitude of his atrocities, is actually a version that can be, paradoxically, somewhat distorted. Because if we dare to make a comparative balance with other historical figures, dictators and tyrants of a not-so-distant era, men like Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, or Pol Pot, whose hands were also stained with the blood of millions, it could be argued that, in terms of the scale of human devastation, they were tragically on par. However, Adolf Hitler stands out. He rises as a disturbing anomaly, precisely because of the overwhelming difficulty, almost an intellectual impossibility, of offering a simple and exhaustive explanation of why his influence went so far, of how he was able to catalyze such deep and virulent fanaticism among his own people. It is not just about the number of lives lost, but about the quality of the mystery surrounding his rise and power. Certainly, the ruinous post-war economic conditions, the deep social humiliation felt by a defeated nation, rampant political instability, and widespread despair, all these contextual factors offer a solid and plausible explanation for the rise of extremist movements. Any student of history, or even a casual reader of the events that marked the Weimar Republic, could, in an instant, refute any superficial questioning, simply by analyzing the undeniable historical facts that paved the way for Adolf Hitler's ascent to power. But, despite these logical and well-founded explanations, doubt persists, an unbreakable shadow clinging to the periphery of reason. Because one thing is the history that details to us, from sociological, economic, and philosophical perspectives, how this man managed to ascend to the pinnacle of power. And quite another are the events, the little strange things that occurred along his path, anomalies that defy a purely materialistic interpretation, and that, for many, suggest a darker and more esoteric influence. Adolf Hitler, in effect, seemed to harbor little strange things in his orbit, events that deviated from the merely human. It was in 2013 when a publication, presumably of Romanian origin, although its traceability was as nebulous as a dream's veil, erupted into the digital sphere with an assertion as audacious as it was implausible. Adolf Hitler, according to its authors, had sealed a pact with the devil himself. They asserted it with a conviction bordering on the dogmatic, proclaiming the tangible existence of such a document supposedly found and recovered. The dissemination of this news was, in essence, a viral explosion in the nooks and crannies of the internet. Countless pages replicated the same narrative, word for word, feeding the maelstrom of speculation. They insisted that a certain Dr. Greta Liver had subjected the calligraphy of the signature to a meticulous analysis, recognizing in it the unmistakable signature of Adolf Hitler. But the assertion did not stop there. It rose to an even more macabre level, assuring that the technicians who examined the supposed document had confirmed that the signature had been made with human blood. The image it evoked was powerful, disturbing. A piece of ancient parchment, red ink, the firm stroke of an infamous hand, a commitment sealed with a primordial entity of darkness. And, of course, such an assertion, by its very theatrical nature and lack of verifiable evidence, is immediately incredible to any minimally skeptical observer or connoisseur of esoteric mysteries. Any serious analyst, or even an enthusiast of these topics, knows that a pact of that magnitude, of that spiritual and cosmic transcendence, is not forged so easily, nor does it materialize on an insignificant piece of paper. It is not even an indispensable requirement that they be signed with blood, for the true essence of such agreements resides in the will, the intention, and the deepest sacrifice of the soul, not in the crimson ink of a superficial wound. Thus, with high probability, the 2013 publication was, at best, a crude invention, a deliberate hoax, or a simple nonsense. Something that someone, perhaps with the intention of provoking or simply out of a fantasy impulse, invented, published on some obscure blog. And from there, the story multiplied like the foam of a wave, sweeping away the credulity of thousands. And, were it not for what would come next, this program could end here. We would all go enjoy a nice coffee in some quiet corner, and the anecdote would be relegated to the drawer of modern myths. But, as often happens in these intricate narratives where the occult touches the historical, there is a problem, a dissonance that disturbs the apparent simplicity of the conclusion, and the origin of this problem dates back to a specific year, 2006. In that year, the imposing figure of the exorcist of the Vatican diocese, the beloved Gabriel Amorth, a man of unwavering conviction, a true apostle in the fight against the forces of evil, the individual who, according to records, performed more than 60,000 liberations or exorcisms on people afflicted by demonic possessions, granted an interview on Vatican radio itself. It was during that conversation, with the microphone open to the world, when the inescapable question was posed to him. What did he, the great exorcist, think of Adolf Hitler? His answer, pronounced with the authority conferred by his vast experience and unwavering faith, resonated like thunder in the quietness of the studios. He affirmed, without hesitation, that Adolf Hitler and Stalin were possessed by the devil, and that this possession was the only plausible explanation for the magnitude and depravity of the horrible things both had managed to perpetrate without the slightest remorse. Of course, a statement of such caliber, coming from such a prominent figure within the Catholic Church, unleashed the most complex and conflicting range of feelings imaginable. The shockwave of his words spread throughout the world, generating a whirlwind of indignation and debate. Although for minds inclined to the spiritual, or for those seeking an explanation beyond human psychology, what the esteemed Gabriel Amorth expressed might have made some sense, for the vast majority, especially for the victims and their descendants, that was nothing more than an unacceptable justification. The implication, hurtful and deeply offensive, was clear. Adolf Hitler orchestrated all that because he was possessed by the devil. He, therefore, was not guilty. And in Christian theology, possession, in its purest form, often exempts the possessed from moral guilt. Hence, the popular interpretation, with a load of sarcasm and bitterness, suggested that, if Hitler was not guilty, he would probably be enjoying an ethereal paradise, surrounded by cherubs, floating pleasantly on some celestial cloud. The mere idea provoked a universal outcry. Jews, Protestants, Catholics, agnostics, Amorth's declaration united everyone in indignant protest. The image of millions of victims and the memory of the extermination camps were too vivid to accept such absolution. And, certainly, what Gabriel Amorth said, on a purely logical level and given the magnitude of the unimaginable atrocities that occurred under the regimes of Stalin and Adolf Hitler, crimes of which both leaders were fully aware and responsible, seemed to offer an explanation for the unfathomable evil. However, after the storm of criticism and the avalanche of problems that first interview unleashed, Gabriel Amorth, with the serenity that characterized him, granted a second interview, an occasion to qualify his words and clarify the crucial point. In this new intervention, Amorth vehemently affirmed that his statement in no way implied that Hitler and Stalin were exempt from guilt. On the contrary, Gabriel Amorth asserted that both leaders had accepted this malignant influence of their own free will, that they had performed the devil's work completely voluntarily. That is, they had sealed a pact, not with ink and paper, but with the surrender of their own souls to darkness. The nuance was crucial. They were not passive victims, but active collaborators of evil. Not long after, Joseph Ratzinger, the figure who would ascend to the papacy as Benedict XVI, would give his explicit support to this hypothesis, a validation that would resonate with the weight of theological authority. Ratzinger, of German nationality, by the way, which earned him the often ill-intentioned nickname of Nazi Pope, an unfair label that lacked historical basis, as his opposition to the regime was well known, was not a Nazi at all, but he had lived and breathed the rarefied air of that era in Germany, had witnessed the horrors firsthand, had conversed with individuals who had shared disturbing accounts of Adolf Hitler's inexplicable actions. Ratzinger firmly maintained Gabriel Amorth's position, and it is crucial to note that Ratzinger was not a man of trivial beliefs. He possessed vast and profound knowledge in theological and spiritual matters. Thus, when the chorus of criticism and boos rose, what he responded with was serene and unwavering conviction. Gabriel is right. What we witnessed in those moments, the overwhelming cruelty of the crimes, the systematic nature of the tortures, the absolute devaluation of human life, both one's own and that of others, because Hitler didn't care much about his own soldiers either, nor did Stalin about his, was something that transcended purely human explanation. It was something that, without a doubt, had to do with the devil. The words of the future pope added a layer of unease and legitimacy to a theory that, otherwise, might have been dismissed as mere superstition. Ratzinger went even further in his reflections, delving into the enigmatic. In one of his texts, published if memory serves me right in 2002, then Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later be Pope Benedict XVI, affirmed that, in Hitler's circle, strange stories were always whispered, accounts that spoke of disturbing episodes, such as, for example, that Hitler, suddenly and inexplicably, would become extremely nervous, his gaze would wander, and, with an altered tone of voice, he would urge his assistants, or the people around him, with a chilling, "Wait, it's there again," or the narration that the Führer heard a voice, an incorporeal presence that gave him direct instructions, dictating his most transcendental decisions. These details, little known to the general public, are certainly intriguing. Of course, the most immediate and rational explanation for such phenomena would be a psychiatric condition, a form of schizophrenia or psychosis, which could have distorted the perception of reality of an already egocentric and megalomaniacal man. However, in the context of Amorth's and Ratzinger's assertions, these voices acquire a much more sinister resonance, an echo of an influence that transcends the merely psychological. Up to this point in our exposition, the plot seems woven with threads of conjecture and speculation. On the one hand, the ephemeral internet publication, an absurd hoax lacking any verifiable backing. It does not mention where the supposed recovered document is located, nor the exact date of its discovery, nor the identity of the analysts who examined it. The aforementioned Dr. Greta Liver seems to exist only in the very pages that disseminated the fable. Then, we have the powerful but speculative assertions of Father Gabriel Amorth, endorsed by Ratzinger's theological authority. But then a much more macabre detail emerges, a disturbing pattern that has been the object of fascination and fear. Let me share with you an old saying, a popular adage that resonates with dark irony. He protects his own, or he takes care of his own. And in the case of Adolf Hitler, believe me, the evidence suggests, with an almost supernatural insistence, that it was so. Observing the astonishing and extensive list of inexplicable events that surrounded this man, from which he emerged unscathed in exotic and providential ways, the big question becomes inescapable. Was Gabriel Amorth really wrong in his audacious hypothesis? We are about to explore a series of incidents that defy logic and seem to have been orchestrated by an invisible hand. Let me begin the narrative a little earlier. At the dawn of this enigmatic character's life, the first macabre or mysterious incident that looms over Adolf Hitler's existence dates back to the distant year of 1894. Barely a child, at the tender age of 4, little Adolf played, oblivious to danger, on the bank of a frozen river. It was January, the heart of the Austrian winter, and the crystalline surface of the water promised ephemeral fun. Suddenly, with an ominous crack that must have resonated in the icy air, the ice gave way under his weight, and the child was swallowed by the freezing waters. The sub-zero temperature of the water was, in itself, an inescapable death sentence. But, in addition, a treacherous and powerful undertow began to drag him, threatening to submerge him in the depths of liquid darkness. Little Adolf, with his weak strength, barely managed to cling to a precarious edge, desperately fighting against the relentless force of the river. It was then, at the precise moment when life began to slip through his fingers, that a small playmate, of his same age, who was playing nearby, ran without hesitation. Without a hint of fear to stop him, he grabbed him tightly and saved him from the clutches of certain death. An act of childish heroism that defies the logic of age. This small playmate, a child of just 4 years old, shared the same age as the drowning boy. Most likely, in such a traumatic situation, an infant of that age would have reacted with panic, running to seek the protection of his mother or any nearby adult. However, in a twist of fate that borders on the unbelievable, this child ran directly into danger, extended his hand, and rescued the drowning child. That unexpected savior would grow up to become a renowned priest, Father Johann Kueberger, and Hitler himself, on more than one occasion, would recall that strange and vivid experience of having been on the verge of suffocation, of having felt the deadly cold of the water and the saving hand of a stranger. It was an anecdote he narrated with an astonishment that would endure throughout his life. For many historians and biographers, this initial episode in Hitler's life was relegated to the realm of myth. Adolf Hitler, throughout his career, cultivated an immense legend around him, an aura of stories and rumors that fed his mystique and aura of predestined power. Everything that surrounded him seemed imbued with legends, stories, and whispers that, in some way, underpinned this almost magical image he projected. It is fundamental to remember that many of Hitler's closest collaborators, the members of his inner circle, were fervent occultists. They belonged to esoteric organizations, with deep roots in traditions such as the Golden Dawn and other mystical currents. Thus, this aura of mystery, this story of a child miraculously saved from death by another child who, coincidentally, would become a priest, seemed more an invention, a legend destined to glorify his figure, than a tangible fact. This would be so, were it not for a small and revealing article that appeared in a local newspaper, the Donau Zeitung, from that Austrian region. In 1894, this modest newspaper published a note confirming the incident. A 4-year-old boy had been rescued from the icy waters by a small friend of the same age. Much later, Father Johann Kueberger, already in his maturity, would affirm vaguely remembering that incident, but would emphasize that his family had always reminded him, insistently, how he had saved the life of a boy from the region named Adolf. The dots connected with chilling precision, and, from that moment, a series of truly unbelievable events would begin to weave themselves into Hitler's life, suggesting a destiny marked by providence or a force beyond human comprehension. Adolf Hitler, as the years passed, grew up in an oppressive and desolate family environment. His father, Alois Hitler, was an extraordinarily rough man, with an iron character and an almost military discipline, a public official who longed, with unwavering determination, for his son to follow in his footsteps and also become a government employee, another cog in the bureaucratic machine. This patriarch, however, not only exercised an implacable tyranny over his wife, Clara Polzel, whom he systematically mistreated with cruelty, but also vented his frustration and anger on his son, young Adolf, and, by extension, on the rest of the family, plunging the home into an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. In contrast to his father's wishes, Adolf's soul yearned for freedom, artistic expression. He wanted to be an artist, a painter, to immerse himself in the world of Bohemia, philosophy, ideas, a universe vastly opposed to the rigidity of public administration. At 16, he left school. As his academic aptitudes were not precisely outstanding, it was then immersed in a world of compulsive and self-taught reading, absorbing all kinds of heterogeneous knowledge. When the roar of the First World War broke the relative calm of his existence, the doors of the Austrian army were closed to young Adolf Hitler. He was declared unfit for military service, perhaps due to his weak build or some other unspecified reason. But his desire to participate in the war was an inescapable force. Desperately, he began to look for a way to enlist and, finally, managed to join the army in Bavaria, a maneuver that led him directly to the front lines, to the senseless carnage of the Great War. And it was there that truly strange things began to happen to him, episodes that defy the logic of survival. For example, in one of the most macabre and terrifying episodes, a contingent of 7,000 German soldiers was sent from one front zone to another, an infernal march under enemy fire. Of those 7,000 men, only 600 managed to reach their destination, a testament to the brutality of combat. And among those 600, miraculously unharmed, was Adolf Hitler. All the others were left dead or crippled along the way, victims of shrapnel, gas, or despair. Adolf Hitler, against all statistics and logic, had made it. He had emerged from hell. But this was not the only incident. There were other episodes of inexplicable survival. Furthermore, his position within the military hierarchy was peculiar and often underestimated by later historiography. Much has been said that, in reality, he was not a hero or a distinguished combatant in the traditional sense. And in part, it is true. Adolf Hitler was what was known as a bicycle man. His job was that of a messenger, a vital but extraordinarily dangerous link. His mission consisted of moving from one point of the front to another in the midst of the most fierce battles, to deliver urgent reports, crucial dispatches, or any type of communication that would keep the chain of command united. It was a task where survival was an exception, not the rule. Mortality among messengers was alarmingly high. However, Adolf Hitler not only survived this maelstrom of lead and fire, but also obtained a significant decoration, the Iron Cross Second Class, and later, the Iron Cross First Class. For an individual of his low rank, a simple corporal, a very humble position within the officer scale, to receive such distinctions was extremely unusual and surprising. Adolf Hitler, the insignificant corporal, rose with honors in a conflict that devoured millions. And not only that, but he would be the protagonist of another extremely strange experience, which would add to the list of his miraculous escapes. It was 1916. Hitler was in the gloomy and damp reality of a trench, sitting, immersed in the monotony and terror of waiting. Suddenly, a voice, clear and peremptory, resonated in his mind, or perhaps in the air around him, an unequivocal order: get out of there right now, get out. Adolf Hitler, without thinking twice, without questioning the source or logic of the instruction, jumped out of the trench with astonishing speed, beginning to run desperately. And just at that precise instant, a bomb, an artillery shell, that seemed destined with macabre precision, fell inside the trench he had just abandoned. The explosion was devastating, blinding, deafening, and pulverized most of his platoon. Adolf Hitler, miraculously unharmed, remained stunned, contemplating the carnage, the smoking remains of his comrades, the vision of a death he had evaded by mere seconds. An invisible force, or an unbreakable premonition, had saved him again. The official version, more prosaic and devoid of supernatural elements, maintains that Adolf Hitler actually jumped out of the trench to chase a dog, his dog, which had escaped in the midst of the battle's fury. But, regardless of the truth behind his escape, the undeniable fact is that the platoon perished almost entirely, and Adolf Hitler survived. And what adds a layer of verisimilitude to the voice version is that there was a witness, another soldier, who miraculously survived the explosion, who saw Adolf Hitler jump out of the trench just seconds before the bomb fell and detonated. It seemed that, once again, a hidden hand, a mysterious force, fervently wished for this man to live, preserving him for an even darker destiny. And there were other similar episodes where death, once again, seemed to evade him in an improbable way. Nearby explosions that did not reach him. Projectiles that flew over his head without touching him. Hitler was wounded on several occasions, yes, but always non-fatally, as if he were only allowed to graze the threshold of the end. In fact, in September 1918, another incident occurred that defies any rational explanation. In that crucial month, Adolf Hitler was on the battlefield. Just 2 months later, Germany would surrender, ending the Great War. But at that moment, the fighting was still fierce and brutal. The English forces had advanced overwhelmingly, destroying everything in their path. And Adolf Hitler lay wounded, vulnerable, desperately trying to move near a small bridge, seeking refuge in its shadows, while other English soldiers lurked nearby. The tension in the air was palpable, laden with dust, sweat, and the stench of death. Suddenly, from an elevated position, an English soldier, an elite sniper, managed to spot him. He was not just any shooter. This man held the sniper's medal, a distinction that accredited his lethal aim and his coldness in combat. The name of this sniper was Henry Tandy, a figure who would go down in history for this fortuitous encounter. Tandy managed to see a German infantry corporal dragging himself with difficulty across the terrain. He was so close that, for a shooter of his caliber, it was impossible to miss the shot. He aimed, prepared his rifle, the target in his sights, ready to pull the trigger and end the enemy soldier's life. But at that decisive instant, Tandy noticed the extreme condition of the German. He was so severely wounded that he could barely hold his own rifle. It is understood that, in a moment of fleeting compassion, Tandy felt pity for that man, so close to the end of a war that had devoured millions, so brutally wounded. He decided not to shoot. He lowered his rifle, and at that precise moment, he managed to observe how the German soldier, with a supreme effort, made a gesture of gratitude. A nod of his head. The soldier, dying on the ground, had realized that that Englishman had just spared his life. And that soldier, that infantry corporal saved by an act of pity, was Adolf Hitler. Fate had intervened once more. Years later, in the autumn of 1938, in a context of growing diplomatic tension and the shadow of a new war looming over Europe, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain paid a visit to Germany. His mission was desperate: to try to negotiate a peaceful solution to the conflicts brewing with Hitler's regime, seeking to avoid the imminent disaster. When Chamberlain was led to Adolf Hitler's private study, in the heart of the Führer's power, the British Prime Minister was surprised to see a singular painting hanging on the wall. The painting depicted a war scene. with English soldiers, and one of them, with an expression of effort, carried a wounded man. Intrigued by the unusual choice of art, Chamberlain asked Hitler why he had that painting in his study. The Führer's answer was as enigmatic as it was revealing. He replied that the soldier carrying the wounded man had once saved his life. The painting had a story, and Chamberlain, who was a well-informed man, knew it. That painting was, in fact, an artistic reproduction of a real photograph taken at the end of a battle. And the man carrying the wounded man was, indeed, Henry Tandy. Adolf Hitler affirmed, pointing to the copy of the original painting, that this was the man who had spared his life. When Chamberlain, understanding the profound implication, said to him, "He has a story. He is an English soldier," Hitler replied with a surprising instruction. "Please, if you know him, send him my regards." The irony was palpable. Fate intertwined its threads in an inexplicable way. Adolf Hitler had providentially survived a direct confrontation with a ruthless sniper, a man decorated for his lethal effectiveness, who had cut short countless lives, and yet he had spared his life. The hand of fate, or some other entity, seemed to play a fundamental role in his preservation. But the chain of improbable escapes does not end there. When Adolf Hitler finally left the horrors of war, surviving the battlefields that devoured millions, he found himself in a desolate and convulsed Germany. His spirit was deeply dissatisfied with the actions being taken to rebuild the nation. First, the armistice imposed after Germany's defeat had inflicted devastating economic damage, a deep wound from which the country would take time to recover. Subsequently, the establishment of the Weimar government, in an attempt at democracy, resulted in political, social, and economic chaos, with hyperinflation and deep instability. In this breeding ground of despair, Adolf Hitler joined the protests, manifesting an agitation and fury that made him a magnetic figure for the discontented. His voice, which had already inflamed spirits in the war, began to forge a new political identity in the whirlwind of the post-war period. In one of those turbulent protests, if memory serves me right, in the vibrant city of Munich, Hitler was at a meeting, expounding his increasingly radical ideas. Suddenly, someone, an individual disagreeing with his vehemence and proposals, began to argue with him, sparking a conflict. Several men rose from their seats, with the clear intention of assaulting Hitler, who, along with one of his associates, tried to escape the enraged mob. The confrontation moved to the street, where, on the sidewalk, the attackers began to beat them savagely. But the intention of those men was not merely to give them a beating. The objective was much more sinister. They wanted to kill them. These individuals, with deadly determination, carried knives, and the intention was clear: to end the lives of Hitler and his companion right there, on the blood-stained pavement of Munich. An abrupt and brutal end for the man who would become the Führer. This incident is deeply curious, as in that same spring, Hitler had formally begun his political activity. For some time, he had been immersed in obsessive reading, absorbing ideas and theories that led him to a new form of radicalism, and suddenly they were trying to assassinate him. And, guess what? At that critical moment, someone, with inexplicable speed, ran to notify a kind of irregular police operating in the area, formed by ex-combatants and war veterans. These men arrived at the scene with astonishing synchronization, just as the attackers were drawing their knives, ready to cut Hitler and his companion into small pieces. The man leading that group of ex-combatants fired a shot into the air, a roar that broke the tension and dispersed the crowd, thus saving Adolf Hitler's life from certain and violent death. Another miraculous rescue, another turning point in his destiny. The most curious thing, do you know what it is? The name of that providential man was Michael K., an Irishman. This Irishman had served in the English army when the Great War broke out. However, when he was captured by the Germans, and realizing his Irish nationality at a time when Ireland was seeking independence from Great Britain, they offered him an unexpected opportunity to join the Kaiser's Irish Brigade, a unit formed by Irishmen fighting against the English. And this man, Michael Keogh, gladly accepted the proposal. He joined the German ranks, and what is even more astonishing and borders on pure chance, they sent him to the same battlefield where he fought side by side with a corporal named Adolf Hitler. They shared trenches, dangers, and the dehumanization of war. And that day, in Munich, when more than 200 agitators wanted to end Hitler's life, Keogh and his small group of men, barely 5 or 6, faced an overwhelming crowd. The chances of success were minimal, but seeing that Adolf Hitler's life was at stake, Keogh approached, fired into the air to scare the people, and in the ensuing confusion, a shootout broke out. Everyone ran, and, once again, Hitler's life was saved. The coincidence that his old comrade in arms recognized him and acted was so extraordinary that it defies any simple explanation. It was as if a script was already written for him. After this incident, Adolf Hitler became even more combative. His political activity intensified exponentially. In 1923, the infamous beer hall putsch occurred, an attempted coup d'état in Munich, an insurrection in which the Nazis tried to overthrow the Bavarian government. A shootout was organized, the streets of Munich were stained with blood, some ended up dead, others were executed, and Adolf Hitler, along with a couple of his closest followers, his intimate collaborators, was sent to prison. The accusation against Adolf Hitler was high treason, a serious charge that, at that time, carried a single and severe penalty: the death penalty. It was that simple. There were no other options, no mitigating circumstances. It was a crime comparable to that of a deserter, or even worse, given that he had provoked an armed uprising against the established government. The guillotine, or the firing squad, awaited him. Several of his closest collaborators, figures who would later become the top leadership of the Nazis at that critical moment, fled in terror. They escaped out of fear, aware that the situation was lost, that defeat was imminent and conviction certain. Adolf Hitler, however, went to prison. But, to his surprise, and that of many, he was not confined to the terrible dungeons in the darkest and dampest depths of a state prison. No, they sent him to a prison that, due to its conditions, could be considered quite decent, almost a privileged place of confinement. There he could receive visitors, have access to his books, write, send letters, a space conducive to reflection and ideation. It was precisely in this singular confinement where he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, the work that would lay the foundations of his destructive ideology. And when the time came for the sentence, the verdict was strangely lenient. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. No forced labor, no hardships, no additional punishments. 5 years, a surprisingly short period for such a serious crime. They gave him more than enough time to prepare all his future political strategy, to refine his ideas and tactics. The most curious thing, what adds a layer of intrigue to this episode, is that one of the judges of the court was a declared sympathizer of what Adolf Hitler professed. Once again, he had been saved by a hair's breadth, by a providential coincidence, because, by chance, the other judges were not in favor of Adolf Hitler, and would have preferred, without a doubt, that his head be cut off. But it did not happen, and, from that moment, the events in Hitler's life would acquire an even more improbable tint, as if a superior force protected him from every attempt of fate to stop him. Adolf Hitler had lived for several years on the razor's edge, flirting with death and ruin. But every time something threatened to harm his life or endanger his meteoric rise to power, suddenly and inexplicably, an event occurred that saved him, a twist of fate that pulled him away from the abyss. After those incidents and his stay in prison, in 1930, he was in the midst of his political campaign, a crusade to bring his ideology to every corner of Germany. Around December of that year, he was traveling in a car. With him were 2 other people, and the driver, a small entourage amidst the maelstrom of his rallies and public appearances. They were moving from one place to another when, upon reaching an intersection, Hitler's car driver, perhaps due to overconfidence or a moment of distraction, was not careful enough and crossed without noticing that a huge truck was approaching, loaded to the brim and at high speed. The impact was inevitable. Hitler's car was hit, but not severely. It simply impacted it and sharply diverted it to one side. The truck, in a desperate attempt to dodge it, had swerved the wheel at the last minute. Hitler's driver had braked hard. The conjunction of these events, a choreography of tragedy, caused the out-of-control truck to violently crash into another car coming in the opposite direction, taking the lives of the people traveling inside. Death, once again, had passed by the Führer. For some mysterious reason, Adolf Hitler did not suffer a single scratch. His car, yes, had a dent here and there, silent testimony to the impact, but the other people, the innocent lives in the other vehicle, tragically lost their lives. Mysteriously, Adolf Hitler emerged completely unharmed from that brutal car accident. And, furthermore, with a surprising display of pragmatism, he filed an insurance claim. Because that's right, very Nazi. But he had his car insured, a detail that humanizes, or dehumanizes, his figure. The policy, the request for insurance payment, was auctioned in the United States at an auction house in 2000. That is, it was a real document, autographically signed by Adolf Hitler claiming the insurance payment, tangible proof of his miraculous survival and his bureaucratic meticulousness. An object that, beyond its monetary value, contained the echo of a life that seemed protected by unfathomable designs. But, from that moment on, events would become even more outlandish, defying any rational explanation. Let me tell you about this other event, which occurred in 1931. John Scott Ellis, a renowned horse racer, was in Germany participating in a car race. He was driving his brand new and beautiful red Fiat, a small sports car that flew through the streets. And this man, it must be said, was a daredevil behind the wheel. He was in Munich, and he was speeding through the narrow alleys of the city. Suddenly, turning a corner, with reckless imprudence, he found himself face to face with Adolf Hitler, who at that precise moment was crossing the street. And, guess what? The car, which was coming at full speed, miraculously stopped just inches from Adolf Hitler, who, by the way, tripped and fell to the ground. But, improbably, nothing happened to him, not a scratch. It was as if an invisible hand, endowed with superhuman strength, had stopped the car at the last instant, defying the laws of physics and inertia. All his companions who witnessed the scene were stunned. They thought, with paralyzing certainty, that that car was going to kill him. Of course, when the racer John Scott Ellis got out of the car, he couldn't believe what had happened. He hadn't seen him turn the corner. And Adolf Hitler, crossing where he shouldn't have, he would have killed him, no doubt. Once again, something, or someone, had prevented the fatal outcome, preserving the life of the future dictator. But this series of incidents was not the last. That same year, 1931, on December 22, another equally mysterious accident occurred. Hitler was returning from Goebbels' wedding in a festive and relaxed atmosphere. Traveling in a car with a general, they were chatting animatedly, immersed in the joy of the celebration. Suddenly, inexplicably, the driver lost control of the vehicle, as if an invisible hand had sharply turned the steering wheel. Snatching control from him, the car spun several times, skidded, and violently crashed into another vehicle. 2 people died instantly, lives cut short by the brutality of the impact. In fact, the driver and another assistant were seriously injured, with life-threatening injuries. Adolf Hitler, on the other hand, as incredibly as it seems, barely hurt a finger. The disparity in the consequences was so abysmal that it defied any accident statistics. It was as if an invisible barrier protected him, allowing tragedy to devastate others, but not him. Evidently, from then on, Hitler became more cautious and adopted the habit of always using his Mercedes cars, for which he had great affection. Although, for some strange reason, he always chose that brand. Except on one occasion, when Henry Ford gave him a huge and beautiful Ford car. But the rest of the time, his vehicles were Mercedes, a choice that, perhaps, sought the security that fate, or something more, seemed to capriciously grant him. But that's not the only thing that happened. From that moment on, an even more outlandish series of events began to weave into his life. A plot of failed assassination attempts that consolidated the idea of supernatural protection. On the 9th of February 1932, a man, consumed by desperation and conviction, tried to kill him. He was an individual who had been a fervent Nazi, but who now felt deeply disappointed by the direction the movement was taking and by the actions he witnessed. He had come to the conclusion that Adolf Hitler was completely insane and that he would inevitably lead Germany to total disintegration. A premonitory vision. For, indeed, he was lucidly anticipating the cataclysm that was approaching. This man, Ludwig Assner, conceived the idea of assassinating him on his own. He did not need a criminal organization, nor complex plots. His plan was personal and driven by an unwavering conviction. Only one other person knew his audacious idea and what he was planning. His strategy was simple, almost elegant in its deadly simplicity. From France, he would send a letter, a poisoned letter, addressed directly to Adolf Hitler. The idea was brilliant, if one wants to think in terms of lethal efficacy, because when Adolf Hitler took the letter in his hands, read it, and subsequently touched his lips or brought his fingers to his mouth, the poison would take effect. Some poisons even act by contact, penetrating the epidermis with stealthy efficacy. Therefore, it was a well-conceived idea to kill Hitler. Except that, for some mysterious reason, Adolf Hitler's circle of protection found out. They somehow inexplicably learned that a poisoned letter was approaching and managed to intercept it before it reached its destination. Once again, a mysterious intelligence seemed to anticipate every threat. This man, Ludwig Assner, did not give up so easily. His determination was ironclad. In fact, he traveled to Germany with the purpose of trying to end Hitler's life directly, carrying a small pistol, carefully hidden in his pocket. He had acquired the weapon with the intention of executing his plan. He tried to approach the Führer, but, once again, the Gestapo, with almost preternatural efficiency, managed to identify and neutralize him. They did not kill him at the moment. Assner died in 1940, supposedly hidden somewhere in France, although there are other versions that claim he was captured and died a horrible and brutal death at the hands of the Gestapo. But, again, Hitler had been saved by a hair's breadth. By a coincidence that defies the logic of probabilities, the shadow of implacable protection extended over him. And so we come to the year 1936. On the 20th of December, 1936, Helmut Hirsch, a young Jewish man, no older than 20, belonging to an organization known as the Black Front, a group of vehement anti-fascists, was deeply convinced that the entire Nazi movement would unleash an unprecedented catastrophe in Germany and in the world. The Black Front, with desperate courage, tried to block Adolf Hitler's actions, tried to resist in multiple ways, and in their frustration and conviction, they decided that the only way to stop him was to kill him. The best idea they came up with was to assassinate him with a bomb, an act of terrorism justified, in their eyes, by the imminence of horror. They planned everything with astonishing meticulousness. Helmut Hirsch would travel to Germany to a specific point where he was to receive a package, a suitcase loaded with explosives that he was to place near the podium from which Adolf Hitler would deliver one of his speeches. These were massive speeches, with Hitler often very exposed to the public. Everything seemed to proceed as planned for that December 20. Hirsch arrived at the train station, where he expected his companion to hand him the suitcase, but he never appeared. So he found a hotel and stayed there. Oblivious to the terrible truth, the Gestapo had a spy infiltrated in the Black Front. There were several members who pretended to be anti-fascists, but were actually undercover agents. Therefore, they learned of the plot, captured Hirsch, and executed him. They cut off his head. A summary and brief trial sealed his fate. Several countries intervened, asking for his life to be spared, but the Nazi regime refused. Adolf Hitler, with a cruelty that chilled the blood, specifically requested that the manner of his death be decapitation. It is curious, because the Gestapo agents did not seem to have been so close to the planning of the attack. To this day, it is unclear who leaked the information with such precision. What is an undeniable fact is that they found out, and Hitler, once again, was saved from certain death. And then, in 1938, on September 28, an even more disturbing event occurred. His own military, the men in charge of his security, and the defense of the nation, conceived the idea of killing him. And this had a weighty reason. They were absolutely convinced that Adolf Hitler, with his aggressive and expansionist policy, would drag Germany into a war it had no chance of winning. They thought that if he invaded Czechoslovakia, defeat would be imminent. But Adolf Hitler, with an audacity bordering on madness and a diabolical political intuition, went beyond their calculations. Not only did he invade Czechoslovakia, but he achieved an improbable diplomatic feat. He managed to get France and other countries to join the dismemberment operation, which culminated in a friendly coexistence of the powers, dividing the country among themselves without firing a single shot. Therefore, the generals, humiliated by their own inaction and by Hitler's unexpected success, had to yield, their fears of war, for the moment dispelled by a bloodless victory. From that point, truly outlandish and, at the same time, meticulously documented things began to happen. A good part of the great military minds, the elite of Prussian generals, men forged in discipline, with impeccable training and vast experience in the First World War, did not share Adolf Hitler's opinions or decisions at all. They disagreed with his thoughtless and risky vision. Many of them could not stand the Führer's impulsive decisions. They saw them as a direct path to disaster. But when the crucial moment came to present his outlandish ideas on the strategy table, and even when all of them had already unanimously agreed to tell him, "No, sir, that cannot be done," none of them, none, managed to articulate those words. An ominous silence hung over the room. When Hitler stood before them, his presence, although not that of a physically imposing man, for his stature was modest, and his physique, not athletic at all, was such that everyone, without exception, fell silent. He exercised an invisible authority, a power that transcended logic, imposing himself with a psychic force that bent even the most experienced and brave. It was a kind of spell, a collective suggestion that paralyzed the will of those who should oppose him. Something inscrutable projected from him. Then, in November 1938, another attempt took place. Maurice Bavad, a young Swiss student, sharp-witted and trained in theology, came to the deep conviction that Hitler was not only an imminent danger to Germany, but to the entire world. He decided, with implacable resolution, to end his existence. He got a pistol, saved money with sacrifice, traveled to Germany, and his plan was to assassinate him during a parade in Munich. Hitler usually passed very close to the crowd, accessible to a shot. On the day of the parade, Bavad was among the crowd, with the pistol ready, his heart pounding. But that day, Hitler was accompanied by several prominent figures from his cabinet, men much taller than him, who surrounded him, preventing Bavad from getting a clean shot. Desperate, he planned a second attempt, to travel to Berchtesgaden, where Hitler had his resting residence, posing as a stationary salesman to get close. But upon arrival, he was informed that Hitler had gone to Munich. He took a train back to Munich, and there he was told that he had already returned to Berchtesgaden. He ran out of money, and to make matters worse, he was captured. He was executed. Another failed attempt, frustrated by a chain of inexplicable events that seemed to protect his target. Subsequently, Georg Elser appeared, a simple carpenter, but with an iron determination. He began to follow Hitler, to listen to him in his speeches, to observe his movements, and, like Asner and Bavaud, he came to the conclusion that he was completely insane and that he would lead Germany to ruin. He decided to take justice into his own hands. He began to work in a bomb factory to learn the rudiments of explosive manufacturing. Every year, at the Burgerbräu-Keller, a famous beer hall in Munich, the failed putsch of 1923 was commemorated with a speech by Hitler. Elser knew the date, time, and place with millimeter precision. Night after night, he clandestinely infiltrated the place to drill a column behind the podium where Hitler would deliver his speech. With patience and meticulousness, he placed a time bomb and calculated the exact time for it to detonate at the climax of the speech, when Hitler was at his peak. On the appointed day, he placed the bomb and withdrew, convinced that his mission would change history. Hitler went to the podium and began his address. But that day, the weather was particularly inclement. A dense fog and persistent rain forced Hitler to return to Berlin by train. To avoid missing the train, he cut his speech short. He finished 13 minutes earlier than planned. The bomb detonated with macabre precision, but when no one was there, 8 people died, 60 were injured. The roof of the place completely collapsed. Of the spot where the podium had been, absolutely nothing remained. But Hitler was not there. He had left, once again, because it started to rain. Elser was captured, taken to the Dachau concentration camp, and kept alive for several years, until in April 1945, a few days before the end of the war, he was killed. Another macabre irony of fate that seemed to protect Hitler until the last moment. And so, we could continue enumerating the countless failed attempts. The English Secret Services planned to poison him, dynamite train tracks, shoot down his plane, place elite snipers in the Eagle's Nest, his residence in the Alps. But something always failed. Hitler changed his mind at the last moment, altered his travel route, modified his schedule without warning, took a different train, changed planes. He was unpunctual, capricious, unpredictable. There was no way to synchronize with him. From 1943 onwards, his own military, desperate in the face of imminent defeat, tried to kill him on several occasions, each time with bolder and more complex plans. But they failed by minutes, by improvised changes in the agenda, by almost ridiculous details, by twists of fate that seemed to mock their intentions. Until the 20th of July, 1944, and with it, the famous Operation Valkyrie, the most celebrated and dramatic attempt, the bomb in Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg's briefcase, strategically placed under the table, next to the Führer. The bomb exploded with devastating force. The roar filled the room. The heavy oak table, however, deflected part of the shockwave, absorbing the lethal force. 4 people died, many were injured, and Hitler, once again, incredibly, survived. With minor injuries, the protection seemed unbreakable, almost miraculous. After this last failed assassination attempt, his final decline would begin, an inexorable descent into the abyss. Hitler aged suddenly. His body and mind crumbled at an alarming rate. The last photographs show him as a sick old man, with trembling hands, his figure emaciated, completely finished. According to the official version of history, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April 1945 in his bunker in Berlin, when Soviet forces were already at the city gates. But, after having heard all these anomalies, all these incredible coincidences and escapes, one might legitimately wonder if he really died there. There are, in fact, persistent theories that claim he escaped, that he lived hidden in Argentina or Brazil, that he died of natural causes years later, under a false name. There are even testimonies of people who claim to have conversed with him, to have seen his aged figure in the most remote corners of South America. The doubt persists. The mystery clings to his figure until the end. And it is at this point that we look with different eyes at what Gabriel Amorth affirmed so vehemently. Was he really protected? Was there a hidden hand that watched over him, that preserved him from death again and again? When one reviews the astonishing way in which he was saved again and again, by strange coincidences that defy statistics because it rained, because he decided not to enter a place, because he changed his mind at the last second, because someone didn't arrive on time, or someone unexpected appeared at the right moment. The inference is almost inescapable. There seemed to be an invisible hand, a surreptitious force, protecting him from every threat, every plot, every accident, a puppeteer in the shadows, pulling the strings of his destiny. And do you know something very curious and little known? A detail that adds an even deeper layer of mystery and credibility to this theory? Gabriel Amorth and Joseph Ratzinger are not the only ones who harbored this unsettling suspicion. On occasion, Pope Pius XII has been spoken of, a papal figure much criticized for not having done more for the Jews during the war and for his supposed tolerance or negotiation with the Nazi regime. What is almost never mentioned, what remains in the whispers of the Vatican's secret archives, is that Pius XII, in private, performed exorcisms to free Adolf Hitler from the devil. The idea that Adolf Hitler was protected by the very Lord of Darkness, by the Prince of Shadows, does not come, then, only from a recognized exorcist or an eminent theologian. It comes, according to some indications and silenced testimonies, from the very heart of the Vatican, from the highest authority of the Catholic Church. After having heard all these barbarities, all these anomalies, all these coincidences that defy logic and reason, what would you think? What conclusions would you draw from this intricate web of events that envelop the life of the most infamous man in history?